In late 2024, the geopolitical situation in the Middle East changed dramatically as an unexpected rebel offensive toppled Syria's long-reigning ruler, Bashar al-Assad, in a matter of 11 days. While this was going on, neighboring Israel started its largest bombing campaign in Syria to date, with hundreds of airstrikes destroying over 80% of strategic military assets left by the Assad government. Israel's military also took over the UN buffer zone, which separated Syrian forces from the disputed and Israeli-controlled Golan Heights, and soon after they moved even further into Syrian territory, occupying strategic positions along the Yarmouk River and around Mount Hermon, which put them less than 20 kilometers away from the outskirts of Syria's capital, Damascus. The situation then seemed to further escalate in February 2025 when Israel called for a demilitarized security zone that would span across Syria's 3 southern provinces to protect itself and the local Druze minority. Subsequently, Israel resumed heavy airstrikes and a new Druze militia began to form in Suweyda province. Whether this will convince Syria's armed groups to retreat or actually spark a military confrontation and occupation by the Israeli military is yet unclear. Syria's transitional government has sharply condemned all these actions as severe violations of its sovereignty. However, this is only the latest chapter in a more than 50-year-old dispute centered around the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights were controlled by Syria until the 1967 Six-Day War, after which Israel took control. And while Israel and the United States regard the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, the rest of the world still considers it to be legally part of Syria. Now it seems that the two countries are headed towards a full-on confrontation, or could a diplomatic solution actually be found? To answer that, we first need to explore how this conflict even came to be. Like pretty much every place in the Middle East, the Golan Heights in southern Syria have a long and complicated history. Arameans, Jews, Assyrians, Romans, Arabs, Turks, these are just some of the many groups that have left their mark on this region, but we don't have time for that, so let's fast forward to the early 1900s. The declining Ottoman Empire still controlled much of the Middle East, and back then, the Golan was mainly populated by Sunni Muslim, semi-nomadic Arabs, as well as the Druze, a unique religious community that split from Islam in the Middle Ages. Then, in 1914 came World War I, and, well, the Ottomans picked the wrong side. With an Ottoman defeat imminent, the soon-to-be victors, Britain and France, started carving up the Middle East like a Thanksgiving turkey that was full of explosives. But two groups were particularly invested in what would happen next. Firstly, the local Arabs, who fought against the Ottomans and expected Britain and France to help them create a unified Arab state in return. And secondly, Zionist Jews, who aimed to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine where Jews have lived before being exiled by the Romans nearly 2000 years ago. Both groups were promised things, but well, things didn't exactly go as they hoped. Instead of fulfilling the promises, Britain and France divided the region into dependent mandates, basically colonies with extra steps, which resulted in decades of unrest. But then came World War II and everything changed again. Under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, Britain and France withdrew from the Middle East, paving the way for multiple independent Arab states. Meanwhile, in 1947, the newly created United Nations voted to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, effectively laying the foundation of the State of Israel. This decision, however, was not well received by the local Palestinians and neighboring Arab states, who saw Israel as a foreign colonial project. Syria in particular rejected the Franco-British drawn borders and claimed land in what is now northern Israel. Zionist forces, on the other hand, viewed the Arab opposition as a final hurdle to establishing their homeland. So what happens in the Middle East in such a situation? War. Almost immediately after the State of Israel was declared in 1948, the first Arab-Israeli war broke out. Syria, along with other Arab nations, invaded and managed to occupy some land, but Israel ultimately prevailed. After an armistice was signed, the disputed territories were turned into a demilitarized zone, although who actually owned the land remained unresolved. But tensions didn't go away. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, skirmishes between Israeli and Syrian forces became a regular occurrence, fueled additionally by water rights issues regarding the Sea of Galilee. So what happens in the Middle East in such a situation? War. Things finally boiled over in 1967 with the outbreak of the Six-Day War. This war began with a preemptive Israeli strike against the Arab coalition, as Israel believed another full-scale war with its neighbors to be imminent. Israel won the war quickly and, in the process, occupied huge amounts of territory, including the Golan Heights. The war's impact on the Golan Heights was massive. While estimates vary, between 80,000 to 150,000 people lived there before, spread across over 200 villages. After the war, only about 20,000 Druze remained, as the remaining population, mostly Sunni Arabs, either fled or were driven out. In the following years, several thousand Israeli settlers would arrive here as well. In the aftermath, Israel wasn't sure what to do with its newly occupied territories. Regarding the Golan, there was even talk about creating a Druze buffer state, but eventually two competing ideas emerged. The first one regarded the Golan Heights as a useful bargaining chip, a way to trade land for peace with Syria, which was a strategy Israel later successfully employed with Egypt. And the second one believed that the Golan was just too strategically important to be ever given back. Meanwhile, over in Syria, things were, let's say, eventful. By 1970, Syria had already gone through 8 military coups since gaining independence, and that year, Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, seized power, and he made the Golan a top priority for the country. So Syria and Egypt met to discuss what could be done next. War? War. Both Syria and Egypt believed that only a military victory could force Israel to return the occupied territories. So, in 1973, they launched an attack and started the Yom Kippur War. At first, things were going better for the Arab coalition, and Syria managed to retake parts of the Golan Heights, but Israel eventually regrouped, launched a counteroffensive, and ended up occupying even more Syrian land. The war finally ended in 1974 after pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, leading to the creation of a slim UN buffer zone. Although the future of the Golan Heights was still being debated in Israel, its government introduced a law that extended Israeli civil governance over the territory in 1981. This meant that the territory was now treated as any other part of Israel in practice, a move that was condemned by the United Nations. The situation basically remained unchanged until the 1990s. And how do things usually change in the Middle East? War? Actually, not this time. What? With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Syria had lost its main political backer, while the United States became increasingly involved in the region. Realizing that military force wouldn't bring back the Golan Heights, Syria saw negotiations as its best bet, hoping to get a similar deal to the one Egypt got regarding the Sinai Peninsula. At the time, Israel wasn't opposed to the idea. A peace deal with Syria could stabilize its northern border and ideally pull Syria away from the influence of its biggest enemy, Iran. And so, the two sides entered talks. But as you might expect, there were complications. Firstly, they couldn't agree on the borders of the Golan Heights. Israel was willing to return most of the territory, but wanted to keep full control over the Sea of Galilee to ensure its water security. Syria, on the other hand, insisted that all the land up to the original 1948 demilitarized zone needed to be returned. And secondly, public opinion in both countries wasn't exactly supportive. In Syria, many saw any deal as a betrayal of the Arab struggle against Israel. Meanwhile, in Israel, many believed that the Golan was historically Jewish land and should never be given back. Unsurprisingly, negotiations were rocky, talks collapsed and restarted multiple times until 2011 when the Syrian civil war broke out. That effectively ended any hope for a deal. Israel-Syria relations only worsened when Assad turned to Iran and Hezbollah for help against the rebel groups. Israel, while officially neutral, was far from uninvolved, regularly bombing Iranian and Hezbollah positions in Syria and even providing limited aid to some rebel groups. However, it never took direct steps to topple Assad, since the chaos in Syria actually worked in Israel's favor and Assad represented the most predictable faction. It was during this time that Israel completely abandoned the idea of ever returning the Golan Heights. Instead, it focused on securing official US recognition, which it finally got in 2019 from the Trump administration. However, to this day, no other UN member state has followed suit, and the recognition was widely condemned as a violation of international law. The conflict then stayed frozen like that until December 2024, when a coalition of mostly Islamist rebel groups launched a powerful offensive, causing the Assad government to collapse. For Israel, this was a worrying scenario. Suddenly, heavily armed Islamist rebel groups were right at its border with access to all the weapons left behind by the Assad government. Then, Israel made a highly controversial decision, which some believe ruined an opportunity for Israel to completely turn around its relationship with Syria. It started bombing anything of military value in Syria into oblivion, destroying around 80% of Syria's military assets, including the entire Syrian navy. It also marched into the UN buffer zone and took control over more territory around the Yarmouk River and Mount Hermon. In response, the transitional government of Syria did, well, not much. They did complain to the United Nations and the US, but that's about it. The situation then worsened in February and March 2025. The Israeli government argued that Southern Syria was becoming entrenched with militant forces which were hostile to their state, but also threatened the local Druze minority. And so it began demanding a demilitarized zone across Syria's 3 southern provinces, and there was trouble brewing in Suweyda as a new Druze military faction formed that demanded autonomy for the country's minorities. Recently, Israel directly threatened Syria with military intervention should conflict with the Druze arise, which some believe is preparing the grounds for a violent showdown that will see Israel try to create a new Druze-dominated buffer zone, which risks reigniting the civil war in Syria. But why is Israel willing to do this after it has been at war for so long already? To understand that, we need to look at why the Golan Heights are so important and what Israel may specifically plan to do in southern Syria to solidify control over it. As its name already implies, the Golan Heights are an elevated plateau. Whoever controls it controls the high ground. And if Star Wars taught me anything, it's that you should never ever underestimate the power of the high ground. And right now, Israel holds that power. Could Israel defend itself without the Golan? Probably. But it's an advantage Israel isn't willing to give up. Besides, the Golan Heights aren't just a strategic region, they are also important in securing access to fresh water and also home to fertile farmland. That said, the economic benefits pale in comparison to the region's political significance for both Israel and Syria. Today, around 20,000 Israeli settlers live in the Golan Heights, and they are not exactly eager to pack their bags. In fact, Israel has been actively expanding settlements instead, so realistically, no Israeli leader would survive politically if they suggested giving this region back. A similar situation exists in Syria. The new government would completely undermine its legitimacy if it ever even hinted at giving up the Golan Heights. This is in part why the current leader of Syria's transitional government has repeatedly said that Syria will never accept Israel's annexation. Fun fact, his nickname, Al-Julani, literally means from the Golan. So yeah, probably not the guy to give up the region. And that stance isn't likely to change, especially since Syria basically has international law on its side. Almost the entire world considers Israel's control over the Golan Heights to be illegal. Of course, Israel does have the United States as a powerful supporter, which argues that Israeli control over the Golan is essential for security. As you can imagine, this position has ruffled some feathers, especially among US allies in Europe who have warned that legitimizing forced border changes could set a dangerous precedent. To still secure total control over the Golan Heights, Israel now seemingly considers to establish facts on the ground by moving its forces into southern Syria and occupying the area, probably in cooperation with the newly established Druze militia. Should that happen, it could try to trade southern Syria for a recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory and the demilitarization of the border region. So in other words, Israel seems to be creating a new bargaining chip to keep the bargaining chip it created in the first place. Should Syria still refuse, Israel may not get the recognition it seeks, but it would nonetheless achieve a number of other goals. Firstly, it would be in control over a new Druze-dominated buffer zone for its former buffer zone. Secondly, it would destabilize Syria and minimize the threat it might pose in the future, while being able to exert even more influence in Syria's politics through the new Druze entity. And thirdly, it could resettle many of the Druze still living in the Golan Heights, most of which have refused to obtain Israeli citizenship until this day. Such a move, however, is not without risks. It would significantly damage Israel's relationship with other Arab states, and it would pose a direct challenge to other regional powers like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who have their own visions for Syria. This could then turn Syria into a proxy war between regional powers yet again. Whatever scenario unfolds, one thing is certain: in the Middle East, nothing stays quiet forever. A big thank you to my channel members and patrons for their support, and if you like my content, consider supporting this channel as well. Here's another of my videos you might find interesting. why not subscribe and check it out?